Let's speak to Nabila Ramdani. She's journalist and a Middle East commentator. Nabila, good evening to you.
Good evening, Adrian.
Were you shocked by the level of today's violence?
Well, absolutely. I mean, this is yet another horrendously sinister development, but it was utterly predictable and, dare I say, expected. This is not the first massacre carried out by the army. In fact, it's the third since the beginning of July, when the democratically elected President Mohamed Morsi was deposed by a military coup, and which triggered protests by his supporters across the country. And this was expected and predicted all along by not only Muslim Brotherhood supporters, but, dare I say, observers, including international observers.
People who took part in the protest had warning that this crackdown was coming. Why then did they stay there?
Well, as far as they're concerned, the way they look at the situation is that, a president who was democratically elected and who they helped bring to power was removed by military force and by martial force. And they feel that they've been let down by the democratic process, that democracy has failed them effectively. And they're determined to reinstate the president and indeed bring an end to military rule. And that's why they've been staging protests against what is effectively and what cannot be described as anything else but military rule. And on the other hand, you've got, another determined force. In fact, the Muslim Brotherhood and their supporters and the army are historical rivals, and they are entrenched, enemies. And the army is, on the other hand, reluctant to hand over power to a civilian government. It has manufactured an interim government, hand-picked government, which has not impressed anyone in Egypt, to be honest, and is also determined to clear, as they put it, areas of protests supporting the Muslim Brotherhood.
You mentioned the interim government. I know that in the aftermath of the violence, the Vice President El Baradei has stood down. How significant is that?
I think it sends a message in the sense that it will be welcomed by Democrats, member of the government, not sanctioning the use of extreme violence by an army whose number one duty is to protect civilian lives and not, to embark on routine street slaughters against its own citizens. But I'm afraid that it's a rather tokenistic gesture because the army is still very much in charge of the country in spite of having an interim government in place. And unless the army is put back in its place as, a body that should guarantee law and order and the protection of civilian lives, then this, will not have any significant impact on the ground.
A state of emergency has been declared. There are curfews in various parts of the country. Is Egypt on the brink of civil war?
Well, it is gradually but surely sinking into, a further state of chaos, and the imposition of a state of emergency and indeed curfews will do nothing to bring about peace to the streets of Egypt. In fact, quite the opposite. It also means that fundamental rights like the right to protest will be taken away from demonstrators, and it will, in fact, reinvigorate those protests. And in fact, on this very night in Egypt, you have further pro-Morsi demonstrators, pro-Muslim Brotherhood demonstrators taking to the streets in areas, very upmarket areas of Cairo, for example, which are not traditionally pro-Morsi, but also across the country. So in the short term, we are unlikely to see any hope of democracy while the army is in a position not just to eradicate the results of democratic elections, but also to carry out routine murders. And unless a culture of democracy takes root, meaning that free and fair elections are organized, but more crucially, that the country sticks to the results of those elections, that they come to terms with the results of democratic elections, then, and if there's no end to effectively the army choosing who is allowed to rule the country, then I'm afraid the killings will carry on unabated.
Nabila Ramdani, thanks for joining us on 5 Live tonight.